Welcome to day 2 of the 13th annual Indiana University Education Conference presented by Indiana Department of Children's Services and Strata Education Network. This year's theme is creating inclusive, innovative, and equitable pathways for learning during COVID-19. We're so glad you're with us. I'm Steve Jefferson from 13 News, and I am so excited to have with me the one and only Fanchen Stinger, anchor with Fox 59. Good morning, Fanchen. How are you?
I'm great, Steve. Good morning. It's so good to see you bright and early this morning. I also want to say good morning to everyone who is joining us. Welcome back if you were with us yesterday, and welcome for day 1 for you if you are just joining the group today. We are in for a fabulous day today, so let's get right to it. As you know, the Indiana Black Expo is celebrating 50 years as an organization. IDOE has been providing professional development training to educators and administrators to help them provide a quality education to every student for 13 years. So thank you once again, a big thank you and congratulations, by the way, to Indiana Black Expo and to all of our generous sponsors for making this conference possible and open to so many more this year virtually.
Yeah, that's right, Fanchen. Without the sponsors, like you said, this would not happen. So we want to thank our title sponsor, Indiana University, and our presenting sponsors, Indiana Department of Child Services and Strata Education Network. We also want to thank our other sponsors as well who are helping make this happen. We're talking about Indiana State University, Lumina Foundation, GEO Academies, Marion County Health Department, Pacers Foundation. We're also grateful for the Colts, Central Indiana Community Foundation, the Lilly Endowment, and Visit Indy, and our training partner, the Indiana Commission for Higher Education. You know, Fanchen, I'm so glad that this is happening because despite COVID, it is not stopping this education conference, which has happened every year.
It's not stopping it, Steve, you're right. And in fact, word is it's bigger than ever before because it is virtual. So that is a huge blessing. And we hope today you get so much from it. We'd also like to thank some of our conference partners. That would be MSD Wayne Township, MSD of Lawrence Township, Muncie Community Schools, MSD Pike Township, MSD Warren Township, the Indianapolis Public School System, Indiana Civil Rights Commission, the Indiana Department of Education, the Indiana Youth Institute, Ivy Tech, and the National Sorority Phi Delta Kappa Inc. Thank you to all.
That's right. We also want to thank the conference planning committee who did not give up on the conference after learning so many things were being canceled, not only in our state, but across the country. And this is very important for those of you who are participating in the education conference. Make sure that you complete your survey for each session that you attend so that you can get your professional growth plan points, or if you need credit for the conference. Make sure you provide your name and information for an accurate account. Without a completed survey with your contact information, we cannot keep track of your attendance and will not be able to provide you or the Indiana Department of Education proof of your attendance and make sure that you get proper credit. Now, Fanchen, I know that you are a praying woman, so I know that you know that this is such a blessing to our educators.
It is a blessing, and we just hope that everyone who is joining today, that you get the information you need. We are going to be continuing to pray for you as you go throughout the school year. There are so many difficult and sensitive things that we're going to be dealing with, and we're also going to pray for our children and most importantly for each other. So we just want to let you know there is a group of people praying for you continuously as you continue to pour into our students and our young people, and we know that each and every one of you need prayer and support too. So Steve and I will be definitely praying for all of you. Well, let's get the day started because there's an exciting day on tap full of information. Our first session today is the importance of social-emotional learning for adults and youth. So please help me welcome our session moderator, the talented Miss Brittany Collins. She is the manager of post-secondary outreach and career transitions, the Indiana Commission for Higher Education. Brittany, good morning. Have a great day. Good morning. Thank you, Fanchon and Steve. Again, yes, welcome everyone to day 2 of the conference. I have the pleasure of also introducing today our starting off session. So we have Christy Berger as well as Dr. Brandy Oliver today. I'll briefly go over their bio information, and again, as housekeeping notes, don't forget that the link to the survey that was mentioned will be added to the chat box as the session nears the end so that you can complete that to get your points. We know that social emotional learning was very much of interest yesterday and a hot topic, so we've got the experts in today as far as this social emotional learning in the state, and we're excited for the information that they're going to share. So Christy Berger is the Director of Social, Emotional, and Behavioral Wellness at the Indiana Department of Education. She has been with the department since fall of 2018. She graduated from Anderson University with her bachelor's in social work, where she worked for a time as case manager before returning to school for her master's in social work from IUPUI. Upon graduation, she worked at Center Grove High School for 6 years at the elementary level with the Center Grove schools, for 6 years at the elementary level. She also went back to Indiana Wesleyan to obtain her postmaster's certificate in school counseling. She has worked at the middle school level for 4 years prior to starting at the Department of Education. She's very passionate about creating a positive, whole child focused school environment for Hoosier students. Dr. Brandy Oliver is an associate professor at Butler University, and she teaches in the Master's in School Counseling program. Prior to her current role at Butler, she worked most recently as a middle school counselor, but has experience as well at the elementary and high school levels. She sees her role as a resource and support for professional school counselors, as well as an advocate and source of positive change for all students, parents, and educators. Her areas of focus include social emotional learning, restorative practices, grief and loss, and culturally responsive education. She has served families at Brooks Place for grieving young people, as a support group facilitator for grieving teens, and also as a grief therapist for individual counseling. Dr. Oliver is the co-author of the Indiana Department of Education School Emotional Learning Competencies. She is also one of the authors of the Suicide Prevention and Response Comprehensive Resource Guide for Indiana Schools, a document written in collaboration with the Indiana Department of Education, as well as a response to legislation around that. Dr. Oliver has served not only here in a state capacity, but nationally as well. She served on the Presidential Advisory Board for the American Counseling Association and a board member for the North Central Association of Counseling, Education, and Supervision, and she has held board positions for over 8 years on the Indiana School Counseling Association Executive Board, and she currently is on the advisory board for Evidence-Based School Counseling Conference. So we'd like to welcome Christy Berger and Dr. Brandy Oliver.
Thanks, Brittany. Thank you so much for the introduction. We have pulled up our presentation, so can you just give me a thumbs up, Brittany, that everybody can see that? And then we will also be putting this presentation link in the chat, as we want you to use this however you feel your community and stakeholders that you work with could benefit from that. Please use it and share. We also have a lot of links that we will be sharing to get you to resources that you can take and use right away. So you'll need that link to be able to pull those resources. So before we get started, we want to pull up our first poll, and let's talk about who is with us today. We want to make sure that we are really supporting those who are with us. And so we are going to pull up the first poll. It looks like, Marsh, that's not ours, but it should say, what is your role? Any idea? Oh, there's two. Is she looking for another poll? So if we could get poll 1, that'll just have us know who is in the audience so that we can make sure that we tailor this to you. Okay, all right, so we'll go ahead with the objectives for our time today. Thank you for sharing that. Attendees will become familiar with the Indiana Department of Education PK through 12 Social-Emotional Learning Competencies that Dr. Brandy is a co-author of. We released these about a year and a half ago in January, and so these are guidelines for educators on how to embed social-emotional learning into their academic day. We're also going to talk about how can you implement this into your academic day, after school day, community mental health, after school, tons of ways that you can support these social-emotional learning competencies with the youth that you work with. We're also going to talk about the benefits and importance of social-emotional learning for our students, but also for you as the adult and your self-care as well. So we like to start our presentation with some data. We like to lay the foundation. We have pulled this data from the IYI Kids Count data book, which is a great resource if you're not familiar with that. It is linked below and can be used as a statewide, as we've used it today, or it can be used for your county snapshot, which is really helpful as getting baseline data for our schools. So the first stat is that Black students are 4 times more likely to receive out-of-school suspension than their white peers. 80% of our students are not getting that recommended amount of exercise. Almost 26% of Hoosier students did not feel safe at school last year. And we know that with all that's going on around COVID and the racial protest, that number is going to be higher. So that is why we are here to share ways to really foster that safe and welcoming environment in your school setting. And then 1 in 5 high school students seriously considered attempting suicide in the past 12 months. I was a previous middle school counselor, and really this stat still surprised me because this isn't just over their adolescence time. This is really in the last year, we've had 1 in 5 students really consider attempting suicide, which is a cry for help. And then last, the child and abuse neglect rates have almost doubled in the past 10 years here in Indiana. And we've seen that be tied back to the opioid epidemic and really needing to wrap around those families who are struggling with addictions in their home. So if we go to the next slide and we look at the wellness for the United States, right? So that was our Indiana data, but let's talk US, right? So around the age of 13, 20% of our students are diagnosed with a mental health concern. And in addition to that, 5% of our youth are diagnosed with a substance abuse disorder. And we know that mental health and substance abuse disorder can go hand in hand. And we believe that social emotional learning can be a proactive and preventative measure to help support students who may struggle with that. Students who have mental health concerns, we tend to see their attendance kind of lie in that chronic space where they're missing 10% of the school year or more, which is really alarming because they're missing that quality education that they need to be at school to perform. And then youth are 6 times more likely to complete school offered treatments, which is why we've seen a lot of really great partnerships with our schools and our local mental health providers and being able to provide that information and that support at school that's helpful for the parents and for the student plus the teacher. So it's kind of a win-win for all. So then when we're looking at our teens and what are they facing today, why is this work so important? We talk a lot about whole child wellness, social emotional learning, but why? Why is that something that has been a hot topic recently? When we're looking at our students' environment and what they're a part of day in and day out, we are seeing that rise in mental health nationally. We're seeing our students having higher stress levels and their exposure to peer pressure, while it's always been there, it tends to be even more there because of the next column, which is social media, right? So it's in front of our students all the time on a variety of apps. They're on Twitter, TikTok, whatever. They are getting that pressure that can be negative. And so when we look at the social media, we know that there are some great things from that. Our virtual worlds wouldn't be happening right now if that wasn't here, but we do know that that tends to lead to that less authentic connection. Our students aren't practicing, talking one-on-one to each other, in front of each other. Those are skills that need to be practiced at times. There's a lot of exposure to that cyberbullying. They're seeing all of the families and students post the great things that are going on in their life, right? And we as adults know that too. Sometimes you get that overload of, gosh, everybody's life is so great and mine isn't right now. And so that social media tends to give that false idea. And then a lot of times we see our students being desensitized to violence and seeing that things that maybe would have been really alarming previously are not, because they're always seeing violence, whether it be video games, whether it be movies, videos. It's really increased over the past few years. So these are some stats on really why we need to support our students as the whole child wellness.
Okay, so just to, on that less authentic connection, I think it's been interesting. They've done some studies looking at Facebook or even like posts and how many likes that students get. And sometimes I think we try to think, oh, this student's got lots of Facebook friends, or they seem to be popular on social media, but really the research is showing that they could be as lonely, if not lonelier. So it's really not that number of social media friends or likes on a certain page or posting. So I think that that's really interesting about that connection's not deep at all. It's just, it seems to be very surface level.
Yeah, definitely. And so how do we help then, right? If we have these stats that show us that our children are in need of these supports and they're in need of this additional learning while they're at school, in addition to home, how can we support that? So the Department of Education has adopted the multi-tiered systems of support, MTSS, framework as our primary structure for teaching and learning. And so in order to do that, the Department of Education has tried to provide a ton of supports, strategies, professional development on what MTSS is. And so this is just a visual. If you're like me, I'm a visual learner and I can connect with this pretty well. And so when we're in education, we know that every couple of years, there's a new initiative, something changes, you feel like you're really getting good at something, and then we switch it up on you. So our hope with this and this visual representation is that you see that it's truly grounded, where you see those roots. Your MTSS structure is truly grounded in PBIS, so that positive behavior supports, into also RTI, response for instruction, in that academic space, and then also SEL, social-emotional learning. And so if your school is already doing things that are meeting the needs of all of your students in those spaces, please continue to build upon them. Don't start over, don't go back to zero, but really be intentional on building upon the strengths that you have. And then the next line above is that environment, which is so important, especially as we look to the fall, right? We've all been disconnected to our school family or just looked a little different the last couple of months. So really being intentional on that environment. Is it warm, welcoming, and safe for our students? Also for our educators, and then also for all the stakeholders that come into our building. What things can we change and do to make that environment really rich and safe and supported for all? And then what is pretty common is the RTI triangle, right? You'll see behavior, academic, and SEL. And as the state team, we looked and said, what do our educators need the most support in right now? And over the past few years, we believe our schools have done a really great job with RTI and academics and meeting students where they need. But let's focus back at that tier 1 for all of our students, and let's pull in social emotional learning. And so that's where the competencies came from. For academics, our teachers have their standards, but we really wanted to provide a guide for our teachers, our educators, our counselors around social emotional learning, how to embed this throughout the day, how to teach these skills, which is what created our social emotional learning competencies that Brandy is going to share about next.
Okay, there we go. So I think one of the first things that we talked about is just a common terminology. And so we will start with, I'm going to click through this. This is the basic definition that we determined, and we've got that from CASEL. Social-emotional learning is the process through which children and adults, and I love that the title of the session had youth and adults, and then you'll see in our definition, we talk about children and adults, because it, as we will talk about today, it takes the adult component first to be the foundational piece so they can be the good models of SEL. But acquire and effectively apply the knowledge, attitudes, and skills to be able to understand and manage emotions, which I think we all have had our fair share of ups and downs and multiple emotions in the last few months. And so how do we, obviously use these skills to help us not just manage, but also really truly be able to identify and understand what these emotions are. Set and achieve positive goals. So that goal setting piece is really important. And it all connects together. Feeling and showing empathy for others. I think that there's sometimes a discussion, can you teach empathy? I say, yes, you can teach empathy. So the earlier we do these tasks, the earlier that we embed it, we infuse it, we involve our families or community partners, that this is a continuous thing that we're doing. So it's all, hopefully you'll see this connection piece between all these things. And then the belief is, my belief, and I know Christy's belief, the foundation is relationships. And so all of it comes down to that positive relationship with students to students, students to teacher, teachers, you know, with families. So it really does begin with the relationship piece and then builds out from there. And then hopefully when they've acquired all of these skills, we go back to think of that tree model throughout this, because we talk about the tree model quite a bit. Then they're able to make responsible decisions. And so that's the hope, that they continuously build these skills. And then you'll see also be able to reflect back when they've made mistakes and be able to process that as well. So we thought it's probably helpful for some of you that may not be aware of our competencies is to see where they came from and how they were developed. So CASEL has definitely been the leader in this area. And so we were in no way wanting to rewrite something or completely recreate something. So we took the foundational 5 CASEL standards, which you'll see on the left-hand side of the screen. And then we did end up renaming them because they've been expanded a little bit from CASEL's original definition. So you'll see how they connect there. Self-awareness to insight, self-management is regulation, social awareness is connection, which we're going to get in depth in some of the competencies coming up. Relationship skills is collaboration, renamed responsible decision-making to critical thinking skills. It's such a necessary competency and skill set for so much of our education. I think sometimes we miss those opportunities for our students to really learn how to critically think and develop their prefrontal cortex area. And then we felt like there was still a couple things missing. And so just looking at literature, you'll see that it is based on neuroscience, and hopefully you'll see some trauma responsive and culture responsive themes woven throughout the competencies. But we decided it really does start with the sensory motor integration, which takes into account a lot of the brain science. And so we know our students have to be able to engage with us. Sometimes I think a good example is if I have 4 kids, and so sometimes I want to ask them, why did you do that? Or what's going on? I really want to go to this verbal component with them, and they're not ready to be verbal yet, right? They have some work that they need to do from their teenage brains because they're still operating either in a survival state or possibly in an emotional state. And so we really wanted to dedicate time and attention to that sensory motor integration piece. And then mindset. And I know growth mindset's a very popular term right now, but we did base the work on some of Carol Dweck's work, but we wanted to expand that and go beyond just growth mindset and build in neuroplasticity and resiliency skill development. So those are our 7 competencies, and that truly is the foundation of everything that's been developed thus far. So it was interesting when you were talking about environment. I think if this slide and environment go to hand so much. And I think working with students, again, I talked about survival brain. I think that's where I think Maslow's hierarchy needs come in. So when they enter our rooms or we enter into a conversation now online with them, you have to take into account where are they. And I know it was a learning process for me. I thought, oh, I'm going in, I'm teaching my online class. Well, I had to like really push pause, and my students just needed to process. They had a state of uncertainty and unsettled, so their safety level was not where it needed to be for any kind of pertinent learning to take place. And so I think keeping in mind the Maslow hierarchy of needs in all of this work is really important. And being mindful of taking a tutorial stance too, because what I think are esteem needs may be different than my students' esteem needs or belongingness. Safety is, I'm a big advocate of defining safety together, because what I need for safety is different than what Christy needs for safety. So collaboratively really defining that as a class. So again, I think keeping that tree and maybe this head visual as Maslow hierarchy needs is really a great foundational piece to this work. So there's definitely a connection and an intersection between social emotional learning and mental health. And I'm excited to think about the more I think you get involved in this, it becomes really clear, but I think sometimes people want to separate these two, and we would advocate that you try to bring them together. Because when kids are developing, youth, adults, anyone's developing social emotional learning skills, they're really building resiliency and protective factors for their own mental wellness. And so I think that that's an important thing to think about as we are trying to prioritize all of these different things that are really essential right now. This is still a very essential component to a student's mental well-being. And so these are just some great data points of looking at, it reduces the likelihood of chronic mental illness or mental health problems. And then again, I just think it's important if we start thinking about building those resiliency skills, teaching coping mechanisms, all of those are going to be huge protective factors for our students for their overall mental well-being.
And a lot of times our team will talk about physical well-being and how to be physically well. Unfortunately, we have to exercise every day. We have to eat right every day, right? And so if we can take that and look at mental wellness, we have to practice those social emotional learning skills every day. Not only our youth, but also us as adults. We have to practice those skills so that we can be on a path to be mentally well. So just love the connection of that and the importance of bringing those two together.
Yes, it's easy to go back to old habits. And so the more you practice, the more that will be kind of the go-to. So again, it is all about practice. So these are a few more benefits of social emotional learning. So when we look at schools that have truly implemented comprehensive comprehensive social emotional learning programs, they've seen an increase of 11% in their academics, which is always a great thing. If you're presenting to school boards or superintendents or higher level administration, it's good for everybody. But I think that grabbing some of these numbers, knowing who your audience is always important, I think about. Some people in your schools are more concerned about budgets and dollars. So this next one is a great return on investment. So if you spend $1 on comprehensive efforts, the return on investment right now shows about $11. So that's a huge return on what the work that we're seeing in our students. And then we wanted to start in kindergarten, or if your school has a preschool, start wherever your youngest child is entering that building, because and hopefully have a common terminology, common sets of terms. People are all speaking the same language, so it's consistent, it's developmental, it's repeated. That would definitely be our recommendation, and research definitely does demonstrate that's what see the greatest effectiveness and greatest results. And so I think that sometimes we think, oh, we only implement it at middle school, or it's only at the elementary and then it drops off, but we would encourage this to be a PK through 12 or K through 12 implementation process. And then the other wonderful thing is we know that our educators are stressed. That data keeps telling us that over and over. And there's more and more research studies coming out that when adult educators are implementing social emotional learning, whether it be specific programs or they've implemented strategies in their classrooms, it has a very positive impact. So it reduces stress levels, reduces anxiety, greater job satisfaction, teacher retention. So these are all wonderful data facts that we're discovering, and I think will only continuously grow. So here's some myths that maybe you have heard along the way, that social emotional learning is just touchy-feely. That's all we're going to talk about if we talk about SEL work, is all about just touchy-feely emotions, and it takes away from the academic time. Our stance is, no, it's not just about, it does involve emotions to some aspect, but there's many other components, and hopefully you saw that in those 7 competencies. And it really needs to be integrated or embedded within the academics. And so it hopefully is just enhancing academic time rather than feeling like it's a taking away from academic time. And I know that that's a process to get to that point, but I think it's just kind of reshifting our mindsets of thinking about it in that way as an integration or enhancing academics. I kind of spoke to this already. It's not just for elementary. We want this to be developmental, and so we know our teenagers have different needs than our younger students, and so the more that we can continuously teach this and embed this and just make it a part of our school culture, I think you're going to see much better impacts on your students and your teachers. So it's not just about feelings. It is insight is what we have. Our competency is one of the foundational, I would say, competencies, because many things build upon that. But that is not, we don't just talk about feelings. There's critical thinking and mindset, resiliency. There's so many different elements. And then hopefully you do not see this in your schools, that it's only when there's been an issue. And that could be just if there's been a classroom issue that a teacher will say, oh, I need to do this, whatever strategy, because I'm having problem behaviors, or we've even seen that when their student has got into trouble, then that student needs to go to like a social emotional learning group, and that's not best practice either, because I think sometimes when I talk about teaching mindfulness, I love it, mindful breathing, but you don't want to just do mindful breathing when your class is out of control or hyper that day, because your students will connect that to, we only do this when things are going well. And so you want to put it into a regular practice. And then of course you can always do extra if you want to do it when their things are maybe a little out of whack. But if that's the only time you do it, those are the connections that students will make. And then it will be perceived as negative or as a punishment. And so I think it's just kind of being really mindful about how it's implemented and picking and choosing those things. So we wanted to definitely talk about social emotional learning and social justice. And I think there's been some really great articles and some great posts that have come out recently. Dr. Dina Simmons has done she's somebody that I really enjoy watching her TED Talk and some of the things that she posts. But just there is a concern that social emotional learning leaves out social justice, racial equity. And so that is not at all the intention of the work that we've developed. I think we've acknowledged that there's still some work that we need to continuously do. And maybe it's guidance more than really rewriting competencies. But I think that the hope is, just reading this quote, to promote social justice is to have a strong inclination not to stand quietly when someone is being treated unfairly, but early education and the gaps. So basically, if you think about empathy or insight and strength-based, all of these skills are helping our students learn how to see someone else's perspective, how to have the strength to speak up. So assertive communication is something that's one of the indicators in our competencies. So I think that there's a lot that is embedded currently in it, but I also recognize that a lot of those interpretations or specific strategies falls on the adult. And so that's where this adult education really does become very important. So I tried to take from Sykes' work about what does this look like around the leadership component, because if the teacher or the adult in that space is ignoring a behavior, ignoring it as a really rude remark, a racist remark, sometimes horribly, I've heard people say the teacher laughed at a joke. That's just either going to enhance those behaviors, or the student feels like it's unsafe because now we have an adult that's not speaking up. So everyone, whether you're in a traditional leadership, I think sometimes people think only administrators are leaders, but I think every adult in the building needs to see themselves as a leader. And these are kind of some of the, when she talks about some leadership characteristics. So I tried to take them and look at how it could potentially align with our competencies. And so it's funny, this do the right thing. And so I have 2 mottos at my house, and this happens to be one of them, just do the right thing. And that's easier said than done, but it does take knowing who you are. And so that identity development piece, and then having the self-confidence to be able to insert yourself in some difficult or challenging situations. So that human potential, looking at knowledge, hopefully that they're gaining knowledge in all of our competencies, connection. So thinking about social justice, connection, there's a lot of opportunities to connect with people that are different from them, even if sometimes they're like, well, my class is all the same. Well, there's never anybody all the same in just your class, but then think outside the box. I mean, we have had to really stretch ourselves in learning, and how can you connect with a classroom that's across, the nation, or even like globally, right? So there's a lot of wonderful ways, I think, to build these connection skills. Competencies, I kind of put critical inquiry there. So really, this takes time. We all enter in with a different level of competency and a different level of what we've been exposed to, our knowledge base. And so I think that this is something that every adult, and I would say every school, needs to explore where they are in this process, and then where are their learning gaps and where are their knowledge gaps, because I think knowledge is first, awareness and knowledge, and before you're going to do some skill pieces. Everybody wants to have fun. So if this is not fun, students are not going to be excited about doing. And same with adults. I think that I like mindful breathing, but that if it's not fun, it wasn't fun for me when I first started. And so I think you'll not do it. It won't become a habit. And that's what we're really wanting. So how can you make this, again, enjoyable? Something that I think about, how do you keep some novelty to this, right? So even if there's a lesson or a program that you're using, you're not just reading it verbatim, and you're bringing yourself into it, your personality. And then looking at personal renewal, so we'll talk a little bit more about self-care coming up, but that is very, very important. Perseverance connects to mindset, so just try again. So again, this is a very important component of leadership around social justice. And then courage, and I try to link a few there. And again, I think we have to be able to be interested, a real curiosity about wanting to learn about other people that are different, and obviously the same to some extent, but different on levels that maybe we've never even thought about differences. And so I think, again, that takes an adult that has had training and also the skills and confidence to be able to facilitate these conversations. So I think that there's a lot of layers to this component. And then this, I like a lot of Margaret Wheatley quotes, and so it does change, and I think we can do this. I'm all about the together piece. And so really coming together authentically with authenticity, a shared value with some commonalities, but just still, again, recognizing there's differences. And so our willingness to have our beliefs and ideas challenged by what others think. And that's easier said than done. But I think when you've created a classroom community or a classroom environment that is a space that students can share and they learn what feedback feels like, it doesn't feel defensive. And I would encourage, again, the adults to start there. I mean, do you do this in your professional meetings, your professional learning communities? Have you created that space to have these conversations and challenge ideas with other adults? So what does that feel like for you before you would expect your students to enter into that type of learning environment? So I think we have another poll, if this one will pop up. And so just reading the question, the poll is, how confident are you to apply social-emotional learning skills to address issues of racial equity? And so, let me see the poll if it comes up. Okay.
Brandy and Christy, I just wanted to interject and let you know that folks did start to respond in the chat with what some of their roles were. So we do have a host of folks across the K through 12 pipeline, as well as a few others that work to either teach in the post-secondary space or do have that focus as well on K-12 education. We have a few probation officers who have joined, some actual social-emotional learning coaches. Several graduate students have also mentioned that they were a part of the session as well. So just wanted to let you know those were kind of folks who were in the audience.
Awesome. We probably should have said at the beginning, we want this to be interactive. So as you have questions, Brittany is monitoring that. And we can stop and answer those questions, but we will have question and answer at the end if you aren't able to put them in the chat box now. Is there much feedback, Brittany, about the confidence level around applying SEL to address racial equity?
Not specifically to the question yet, but some questions that have flown in before. How do you work with or support educators so that they are in a good place as far as social emotional support and care to have them feel comfortable and equipped to teach these things? And folks have also, and I know we'll continue to go through this, what are some outside resources that may be available out of the building to help equip more educators in infusing that into their curriculum?
Great. Sorry for that. We're going to go here after the next slide really into the resources and supports, and then we probably should have put adult self-care at the beginning, but we are getting to that, and we'll have some resources there to really help the people, the adults who are looking in that space to become well.
Mm-hmm. And I think the question about adult development of SEL, like anything else, it's going to take time. And I think that as they dig into these, there'll be some that they're much more comfortable with facilitating, and then others that they may not be. And so as a school, providing continuous opportunities for professional development. This is more than a one-day PD. And so I think it's best to always start with your adults rather than asking the adults to implement and deliver straight to the students. And so having that, again, that mindset shift, although I know students need this, and I'm not saying you shouldn't and you can't do that, but I think SEL is, if your adult doesn't truly understand it, it will not be delivered in a very authentic way.
Mm-hmm.
So
we do have some more responses. So we do have a range from very confident, a couple moderately have popped in, and then folks that have mentioned that they are not confident at this point in time. So thank you all for your feedback on that. As we continue with the content, please now shift to focusing on questions about specific slides. Thank you.
Thank you. So the other thing we really wanted to highlight, I always want to mention the post-secondary piece in social-emotional learning, because we talked about some other aspects and the importance. But what we are learning is what you'll see, these top 10 skills are all connected back to those competencies. Mm-hmm. And so it's not just important for stress management, problem solving, which are all wonderful, leadership skills, but our employers are saying these are the skills we need. These are the skills that we might even see lacking. And so it is important for college and career readiness and for post-secondary success. So going back to think about that slide with that environment piece, to me, this is really, when we think about teaching practices, the environment sets the stage. So when I'm that student and I walk into that, like I think about when I walk into the school, I feel something. I think school culture and school climate is a real thing. Mm-hmm. Just like when students walk into your classrooms, the learning environment, they have a sense right away what this environment's going to be. Are you smiling and greet them at the door? Is it student-centered discipline, or does it feel very punitive in nature? Is it more of a traditional language that's used and kind of traditional practices? I have the teacher language, I didn't post it there, but it's on this infographic. It's great. So one of the things we'll talk about is like growth mindset language or process praise language. And so coming from a place of strengths is always important, because sometimes our students don't see their own strengths, and that could be for we could talk about that for a long time, for a lot of reasons. We don't know why, but how can you make your classroom strength-based? And so sometimes an activity I'll do with educators is, have them, can you write a strength for every student in your roster? And then if it's negative, right? But sometimes they're talkative or they're rowdy. How do you turn that into a positive, right? So somebody that talks a lot is maybe a future leader, or so how can you flip it, kind of shift your mindset? Because the way you view students and the language that you use is really, it's going to be impactful on how much effort they give, on their perception of self. And so I think that that's just a really important component. And you're a model. I think that's something I probably haven't said enough. The adult is the model for these skills. And so if the teacher or educator or adult is not using the same language that they're teaching, or the expectations, there's a real disconnect there. So I always talk about walk the walk. And if you make a mistake, own your mistake, apologize, all those wonderful things. So I think that a lot of these were touched on. So classroom discussions, again, I think that we're all learning together what they look like online and in that virtual classroom environment compared to in-person. But you can still have everything that's listed here in the virtual world and in an in-person world. And so it's just kind of being creative and creating those creative spaces and asking your students. Student voice is really important. And so involve them in this process. I always think about, I'm a facilitator. I'm kind of co-constructing the class with my students. And so I think that that's just another really important component. So here's, I guess, more of a specifics if we want to get into what does this look like. Some of you may already be doing a lot of these, and some of you may be more classroom specific, so we understand it looks different. But I always think, if you want to start at a school level, what are your procedures? What are your policies? Does it align with the competencies? Or maybe you have some work to do to get, maybe some traditional discipline practices, more to restorative practices. So look at your procedures, your policies. Also create visuals for students, practice the procedures. It's multiple times, especially if you are returning to school. These are going to be a long time since these students have been in school and done school. I definitely can attest to that with my own. Establish routines. Routines and structure are vital. And so making sure, again, that these routines and habits, so I talked about mindful breathing. Some classrooms start with mindful breathing in the morning, maybe mindful breathing after lunch, and then mindful breathing at the end of the day. So that would be a routine that is just the kids know this is what we do. Meeting times, I'm a big advocate of circles. And so always creating circles from a proactive relationship building. And then after you do that really well, you can use circles for restorative, to address any kinds of behavior, reentry. There's so many different things that circles are wonderful for. We're going to show you some lessons and where you can find some curriculum. There are structured SEL programs, if that's something your school has opted for. And then the structured activities, students need to practice. I think that's another component around SEL. It's not a lesson that's like a sit and get. They need to experience it. So those structured activities should be intentional, allowing students to apply, practice, make mistakes, get feedback, do it again. So it's really that, again, it should be continuous. So you should just feel like this is something we do in our classroom. And then we have offered some exit ticket options. So that's a great formative assessment, helping students reflect on their own learning, that metacognition piece, and what did they do well, what did they not do well, what do they still need to learn. And so that exit tickets is another great way to just embed SEL into daily habits. So I guess coming up, there'll be a link to some of the lesson plans. And so this specific lesson, it looks like it's on page 49. Thank you, Christy.
Mm-hmm.
And so it looks like Insight 2B is student recognizes personal strengths. And then in student language, we didn't mention that. So they're written where there's the competency as it's written in 2B. And then below it in quotations, if I'm a student, this is what I would hope my student would say after mastering, I guess, the competency. And so if you think about, there's a lot of ways to build strengths in students, but I know I've been in even my graduate level courses where I ask, what are everybody name 3 strengths, and sometimes really struggle with identifying 3 personal strengths. And so as you can help students over the course of time, so this is grades 6 through 8, hopefully if they've been doing this for a while, they can name multiple strengths in their strength bank. And so when they, I think their phone battery's low, that can be frustrating. So what strengths can they tap into? Are they aware? Also, this would weave into emotional awareness. So what might that trigger in them? What did they do in the past? So that would be a strength.
Mm-hmm.
So it is, I think there's so many opportunities that just kind of happen haphazardly, just daily interactions with our students, that we can weave these skills in and then point out when we notice that they've applied, like, hey, I just saw that strength in you. That was really great, right? So always noticing when we see our students doing wonderful things. So regulation is one I feel that most people want to start with, and I understand why, because this is where we notice behavior, right? So when a student's dysregulated, we're not learning, we're not teaching, and we're not learning either, and our students aren't learning. And so there's quite a few opportunities to engage with regulation, but I think my caution would be you can't start just here. It's more than just the regulation competency. So going back to that sensory motor piece, where are your students? Are they brain ready to learn? Because that regulation piece is really critical there. Have you built relationships with your students? Because that's part of regulation. And so there's a lot of components that go into regulation. And then also to remind yourself, are you regulated before you engage in either that conversation or that feedback? Because if you notice that you're not regulated, it will not be a very positive outcome in that conversation. So again, that's where that adult SEL and knowledge and awareness really come into play. And so there's some thought sheets or thinking sheets, which some schools have adopted. So whether that be in the classroom, maybe that's something in the administration office, but a way for students, again, to really bring in some critical thinking as well. So if this were to happen again, what would I do differently? How did I impact this other person? So that empathy piece. And so it kind of just walks them through after they've had some sort of incident, the process. And then this link, I guess, takes you right to the thing sheet.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Apologize. We should have probably put the website to the toolkits on the first page, but if you follow that top link, it'll take you to the SEL toolkit, which will show you all of these different strategies that we're sharing today. Also, once we get to the questions and answers, we will put in the DOE website that houses all of this information so that you can have it, use it however you would feel appropriate. But thinking about the think sheets, one of the schools I was in had buddy classrooms. And what I loved about that was if a student needed to step out of their classroom, they knew what their buddy classroom was. They went there, they filled out the think or reflect sheet. That teacher then told that student to reflect on that, share with me your reflection, and then you can head back to class once we both decide you're regulated and ready to go. But as Brandy has said many times, what was really important and successful with that at the school I was is they practiced with every single student, not when that student was unregulated, right? So they practiced the first few weeks of school, every student practiced going to the other room, what they would do, coming back, learning about how we exit quietly and enter quietly, not to disrupt the classroom more. So again, going back to practicing these skills when we are present and in the moment, as opposed to when we're dysregulated.
Yeah, absolutely. So talking about the teacher language, so I think that this infographic on the left, so in our classroom, things that we say, so it gives you kind of the what not to say. So instead of, right, I'm no good at, so how can I improve asking that question? So you'll see a lot of this is growth mindset language, but having that visual is critical. And so even if you also have some other visuals of words that you hope to hear your students say, or I'm a big advocate of emotional vocabulary development, so like like feeling word walls. And so again, those visual pieces are really instrumental, but as I say that, also that cultural responsiveness piece, make sure your visuals are culturally responsive and that every student in your classroom can see a piece of themselves in the visuals that you're displaying. So be really mindful of what you have in your classroom. And on an online learning environment, same thing, like you're gonna have an online, like some sort of e-platform. And so you can still post visuals and have a page dedicated to these different resources. And so that looks like that is on page 61. So we talked, I feel like I've gone back to sensory motor integration a lot, but really as that foundational component as we move forward, focused attention practices, Simon says movement song, and you can see these are fun, like even as an adult, some, you know, they have put some music on, and but helping, again, teach that repetition so it becomes a habit. And so when you do get dysregulated, it doesn't feel like, what are they asking me to do? Like this is something that has been a habit, they're familiar with this. So, and I would say pick a few that you want to try, and then instead of having 20 mindful breathing exercises, you know, a couple, and where your students feel really comfortable and confident working through those. And then focused attention practices. And there's, when you hit that link, that it will take you to some specific language and directions to those. And I guess before I move on, this also is important. It talks about, I feel awareness of my body in comparison to objects. Helping at all ages, if we don't know our body and mind and feelings, those connections, I'm not sure that we'll ever have long-term impact of regulation skills, coping mechanisms, because so often we feel it physically. And so I always think about when I'm really stressed, I usually hold, like I get a headache. Well, it's because I've been tense, but I recognize that now, right? So over time I have. So, and then when a student gets angry, so do they feel hot? Do they squeeze their fist? And so helping them start to be aware of what's happening in their body, because that can be an early trigger sign and warning for them before it becomes escalated at I always think of the top of a peak, right? So how can they have that sense of awareness and again, modeling that? Is me?
Just last one.
Okay. So this is, and again, this is more of a mindful exercise. So how do you get grounded? So this is something that you can do with your students. And so in a classroom, we would talk about, so take 5 things, look around the room and what are just, and in their mind, I don't know that I don't typically have them do this out loud. So I have like usually a sheet that they can write it down on, or just kind of like in their mind, you know, picture it. So what are 5 things that they see? 4 things that they can feel. And so that could be like, I feel my chair, I feel the floor beneath me. It's interesting, the third one, so 3 things you can hear. When the room is quiet, it's always fun because when we start to talk about it and process it, the students are like, I never heard the whatever air conditioning fan, or I heard the beep on the computer. And so they really tune in to try to listen. So things that they can smell, 2 things that they can smell, and then I love the 1 good thing. So we're enforcing that strength piece there. And so again, this could be a very simple strategy that's implemented once a day, or maybe like you do it on Wednesday or whatever it may be. But again, it becomes kind of that ritual routine piece.
And I think what's neat about that is you could do that virtually or in person, right? So we could have our students share kind of what's going on in their home. Gives you a little insight to what their learning environment is when they're away from us. So it's a great thing to be used in each space. So the next SEL competency we're going to talk about is collaboration. And I believe that this one comes pretty naturally in most classrooms, right? We're talking about working well with others, that teamwork, that group work that we do as adults as well. So we've really got to build those skills. We've really got to know how to have conflict management skills. But what I think sometimes we miss as educators is we put students in teams, but we don't actually process through that. So we don't say, how was your role as the leader? How is your role as the timekeeper? What things were hard? What things were easy? I've seen some educators who kind of have a person that they've tagged as being kind of the pistol, if you will, for the group. So the one who doesn't want to do what they're supposed to do, the one who doesn't want to keep on task. And so that's kind of planted, but then the students can work together on how do we redirect? How do we work as a team instead of just going and doing on our own or always asking the teacher for help? So you'll see there's a ton of learning games that you really can use to build that collaboration among your students, listed in our SEL toolkit. So this one I again think comes really natural. It's great for even your staff and your adults doing some team building, working together just to get to know and support one another in your space.
Yeah, and so the processing piece is something I always talk about is, were your students ever taught how to work in a group? And so sometimes I'll get to the graduate level and my students all ask that question, like, no, I was never really taught. We're just expected to know how to be together in a group. And so really just being explicit and talking about how do you work in a group? What does that look like? And setting group norms as that small group or whatever it may be. So again, it's sometimes we make assumptions that our students have these knowledge and skill sets. And so I think that we go back and we need to make sure that we've taught them and practiced and modeled.
And then the last two that we're going to talk about, the first is critical thinking and advocacy and action, which are so important all the time, but especially right now. And so bringing our students back together and talking about, you know, what are some things that you as students can advocate for? What are some concerns on a larger social issue that are something that you want to learn more about and you want to see how you can support, how others can support. So that's a really great lesson. K-12, we know that a lot of high school students do some of this work kind of as a service project before they graduate, but really kind of investing that early on to really build that advocacy for themselves and for their friends and for others. And so thinking about that skill, knowing that there's a couple different websites that you could go to and find some spaces where you could think about that. Something I actually heard yesterday on a call was, as our students are coming back and we're thinking about social distancing and what that might look at, you could study in other spaces where they've had to social distance and what things did they learn. For example, when the astronauts leave and go on a mission, or if we have people who are in Antarctica doing some research there, they are very socially distanced from others. And so what are the things that they've learned and what are the things that we could share and kind of put some action into place as we are right now still practicing those social distancing measures. And then the next one is connection. And I think as an adult, empathy is a hard skill to learn, but it's a very needed skill. And we need to make sure that our students are learning about empathy, learning the difference between sympathy and empathy. And so there's a book list. We think a lot of times that literacy is kind of that low-hanging fruit of how you can start embedding SEL into your academic day. You'll also see in the Social-Emotional Learning Toolkit that we have a book list of PK-12 of all kinds of books that speak to each of the competencies. And so looking at the books that you normally use in your classroom, could you switch them up? And as you're reading through them, then tying it back to that competency, right? Reflecting back on that competency is so huge. We talk a lot about reset rooms. And so this is a high school example. I think, again, a lot of times we think these skills seem much more natural in our secondary space, but all students and teachers, we have a teacher lounge, right? That's kind of our reset space. And I know businesses are looking to build kind of these calming spaces as well. But thinking about having your students have some ownership into that space. So maybe you use your student council, maybe you use a small group that you're teaching about regulation and say, how could we set up a room in a space like that? And so this is just an example of some positive messages, some places to kind of chill and relax. There's an iPad because the students would have to check in and check in why they were there and then check out saying the things that they've learned and how they've calmed down for many of things. One, as a teaching mechanism, but also to keep track of that student, right? To make sure they're where they need to be. But just having that, having a safe place for our students, I think just gives them that sense of security that they have a place to go if they're feeling overwhelmed. We know that they tend to go to the nurse's office or the counselor's office, right? But having a place where they can go and kind of direct that reset on their own is really huge, really to build those skills. So just wanted to share some visuals of what that could possibly look like.
And that iPad's a great data collection tool. And so just either number of students used it or the time that they've spent there, you might see hopefully a reduction in how much time that they're needing.
Yeah, exactly. So I wanted to switch to a little bit more of the remote learning options, as this may be an option when it come the fall, but also can still be used in your classroom if we're in person. So if you follow that link, the Department of Education has created a remote learning resource database for all topics, not just social emotional learning, but social emotional learning is added there. And so you can click on that and hit apply, and it will pull up what grade levels, what skills they teach, a lot of free resources right now. Some of those will probably switch into being paid, but there's also a piece for parents, right? So a teacher may use this, but we might also send this home with our parents. So I wanted to make sure that we highlighted that. We also created our Indiana Continuous Learning Guidance. And so schools will be asked to continue to submit and have this public for their school community and for the Department of Education. And there's a whole section that really talks about social emotional learning and the importance of that for the adults and the students. And it lists a lot of resources and supports right within that document. So wanted to make sure you're aware of that. It starts on page 29 for social emotional learning, but it has a lot of really great information for all academic topics, but in addition to social emotional learning. We recently released, probably a couple weeks ago, this roadmap to reentry for social emotional learning. And so we want to think about reentry into school and really focusing on coming back. And we looked at 3 different phases. Phase 1 being that end of the school year, how important closure is for our students and our teachers, right? We didn't get to end the year like we normally do, but what were some activities or ways that you supported that? What type of remote social emotional learning or mental health services could your students and families still receive as you were ending that year? Really kind of creating that space for some closure and some support. And then the summer process right now, which you're all participating in, is a lot of professional development. We know that our staff is going to need some professional development around many topics: trauma, responsive work, racial injustice, social justice, all of those things that our teachers are going to be faced with when we come back to the classroom. And so we want to prepare them. And so providing those different opportunities, and there's a ton of, in this document, there's a ton of links to free professional development and just ideas and suggestions of other professional development. But something to really focus to is that adjustment of expectations. I know that Robin LeClaire shared yesterday about the academic expectations, and I think that that's just an anxiety for our students and parents and teachers, right? But we know that educators always meet those students where they're at, and so it's just going to look a little different this year. So what types of things can we adjust in the academic space, but also thinking about the needs of our families? We'll have families who will need free and reduced services, but they've not needed before. They don't know how to ask for that or where to look for that. So what are you doing to make sure that you're reaching out and providing that paperwork for families as we start this school year to come? And then beginning of school year, again, what we're getting ready to do here soon is really important. And again, you'll see that we mentioned closure. If it didn't happen previously, it really needs to happen before we start this new school year. And so providing an opportunity where you can say, you know, your goodbyes to teachers and then kind of start that new year. I've heard a lot of schools share about how they're doing that, where they may have the day that you come get your agenda or your classroom teacher, and the old teachers will be in their position, and they'll be able to really support that closure to say, you know, it's good to see you, and it's good for the teachers too. It's so important. So wanted to draw your attention to that. And then the last thing is we have created, actually we'll go to the next slide. We've created 3 days of activities that are solely focused on building social emotional learning skill. So again, I know Brittany's put in the chat a ton of times this slide presentation, but those 2 links will take you to a primary template and a secondary template, because we know, again, students are different. And so you'll see within that all of the 7 social emotional learning skills, and to the right will be activities, resources, supports that you can use with your students when we come back. Now, you might not use all of these the first 3 days. You might, you know, do a couple of weeks even, kind of span it out. But we just wanted to provide that for educators so that they weren't having to think on that and build all of that on their own, because we know you're dealing with so many other things, especially the academics. But I believe that if we don't take this opportunity to build that connection and resilience in that community when we come back, we're really going to be setting our kids up for not the most successful year. So we believe it's so important to do that. So we wanted to provide those resources for you there. So you can click on both of those templates and feel free to use however you may like. And then the next thing that's within the document that I think could be really helpful is really, again, going back to fostering that safe environment. And so as Brandy shared, we're both love classroom morning meetings, think that they're really important. They bring that sense of community. And as Randy shared, we want to put those things into place, those routines into place, so our students start to feel safe and secure. And then we have some Then we want to bring in topics that are real to our students, right? So you'll see 2 scripted guidance around facilitating classroom meetings, one specific to COVID and then one specific to race. So we know a lot of times our teachers want to talk about these topics, they want to share with their students, but they maybe are just a little unsure of how to do that, or they just want an additional resources. So these are scripted for you to use, really being able to focus in on that culture, climate, and that environment for our students. And then again, you'll see a links to a couple different videos that just can show you how morning meetings are done, if that's something that's new for your school or your classroom.
And I would advise those classroom meetings, in part of your PD back is having your adults go through and sit through those topics and process both of those. So they have the experience again of being a participant and a facilitator, I think is really important process.
And I know a lot of schools who that was already a part of their practice. So when they went virtual, that was the one thing that all students were expected to be at, was that morning meeting. So we had that connection and that support, knowing that some of our students maybe didn't want to be on camera, but they were at least present and signed in was really helpful. So we're going to switch now to talk about your all self-care, adult self-care. And we'll go through this quickly because we know we want to leave time for questions. So just thinking about how often do you practice self-care as we go through these last few slides.
Yes. And so just to, if you're not aware that there is a course, Science of Happiness, and it is definitely based off Yale University's course. It's research-based. It is monitored by the Department of Education staff, and I'll go through the modules here in just a second. But what I have heard other schools doing, so I love that you put on here for PLC. So you can do this on your own, go through this as an individual. You can grab a partner to do this with, or maybe in professional learning communities, or sometimes I think even PDs as a school, they've done pieces together, ask them to complete and then process as they come together as a large group. So there's a lot of different ways I think to take this tool and apply it. So it's self-paced. I love it. I don't know if you want to add anything about the numbers.
Yeah, awesome. I checked yesterday. There's about 4,704 people who have registered, which is so great, so awesome. We've loved when schools have done that together, but just a note, if that's something you plan to do or plan to lead, you all will need to be enrolled to make sure that you get those PGP points at the end. The modules really are pretty tailored just to you as an adult. We really wanted to focus on that piece and really give and reserve that time for you as educators. So it's a really great learning experience. There's a journal that goes along with it, not required. The only 2 things that are required are 2 10-question quizzes and then submitting a happiness plan, and then you get 45 PGPs, which is amazing. And we've had people from all other states. So if you're joining us today from another state and you would like to join, please feel free to do that. The video and the links will take you to where to do that.
So just to again, I think I think we're doing better actually. I used to say we don't do this well, we don't talk about it enough, but I think we're getting better at talking about adult wellness and educator wellness, because there's so much on the plate of an educator. And in the Science of Happiness class, it actually went before the very first module, there's a, I guess, pre-learning module about compassion fatigue and vicarious trauma, because you're carrying a lot with you. So you have your own lives, right? And then you're listening and interacting with your students, and you're hearing a lot, and sometimes a lot of trauma. And so what do you do with that? How do you process that? And how do you make sure that this self-care piece and personal wellness is truly a priority? Because it's typically the first thing that we let go of is we aren't very selfish when it comes to this part of ourselves at all. And so hopefully just again, reminding that I always try to remember I'm a role model too in this area. So sometimes I do better than others. So, but I also will admit to that, right? Hey, I had a bad week on self-care. I've done behavior charts with my class to try to make it fun. It's not behavior, but how, did you complete your self-care task this week? And so it's a shift, right? So we have to make it a priority and be able to talk about it and what got in the way of doing it. Do we need to adjust it? Because it's a habit and a routine that we hopefully will model, and then our students won't be as stressed as we saw 10, 15 years from now. So we did get through those quickly, but the website on Science of Happiness has a lot of more information as a preview too.
And the infographic that was shared, that will link you to just suggestions and strategies. I sent something similar to the Department of Education staff, just as a reminder, right? We forget about those things that we should or could be doing to really support ourselves. So that is a PDF that you can share with your staff. It really speaks about the beginning of COVID. So we're looking to create the language where it will switch to as we return to school. So we'll be updating that as well. So Brittany, we would love to hear and answer questions as you see them come through.
Yes, so just to start things off, some folks have asked more about how they can get the PowerPoint. So sometimes with Google Slides, if there is a lot of folks tuning in to look at the information, it may actually only allow you to see it as a presentation for that point in time. So please make sure that you bookmark it on your browser so that you can refer back to it later once you are able to have that download capability. But thank you both. There have been a lot of questions who have been asked about some of the information. You have covered several of these things throughout, but wanted to definitely ask questions about some specific themes. So when we talk about age and grade levels, folks are saying kind of what can be done to support students who maybe have not received social-emotional learning development in the early learner years. So how to kind of make up for that. And then also, again, going into more depth on how this can be very useful and helpful for older students who maybe are in high school or even at the college age.
Great. Questions are great. I will tackle that first one and Brandy can chime in. So Brittany, could you put our website in the chat box? It's just
Yes.
DOE. Okay. So if you pull up our STBW website, you'll see that we have a really large document of PK-12 so that you can see that cross alignment, that vertical alignment, excuse me, and how that can tap into cross-curricular, right? So how to build that upon each other. But then what you can do, which I think is really helpful, is just look at your specific grade band. And so it's like PK to second grade, third to fifth grade, sixth to eighth, and so on. And so if you pull up that, it will show you those skills and how to build upon them. We know that some of our students, just as we meet them where they are with that academic piece, right, that they'll need some additional support. So that's when you're thinking about that MTSS model. And if you've identified a student as really struggling with regulation or collaboration, they might need a small group by your student service personnel. They might need a one-on-one. They might need some additional coaching and teaching, just as we would with our academics. And so thinking about when you're identifying students who need additional supports, we got to pull in the SEL as well. And so what can the additional supports that are within the school be able to provide, I think is really huge and is important. Thinking about those developmental stages is really important. Anything?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, it is, the recommendation is to start early, right? So those, I call the neural pathways are like, you know, strong, right? They're myelinated, they're like the go-to pathways, but that doesn't mean every student can move from district to district and would not have had access. And so I don't think that there's ever, we start where they are, we meet them where they are. And so can they, do they have some coping strategies? Can they name their feelings? And so really it's just meeting where they are, where their needs are, and then also getting to know our students. And so I have teens, and my oldest son will be a senior, and he was having some behaviors that we didn't really appreciate on the basketball court, some regulation issues. And so I was trying to figure out how can I help him look at feedback differently, or when, you know, whatever. So I found some Steph Curry videos and, you know, try to, like, that is something he would actually sit down with me if they weren't too long, right? And like, so how do you understand your students' interests and passions so it doesn't feel, that's the unfortunate part if it's a super structured program and they won't flex from that, is like meeting your students where they are and their interest, and so at any developmental level. Hopefully that helps answer that question.
And then I think for secondary and then higher ed, we actually presented to the higher ed admissions counselors, and we heard from them over and over that students with time management, or as Brandy shared earlier, that collaboration, working in groups, it's so important. And it might be the first time that they're away from their family. And so they're really trying to find what is their support group, what is who they call on when they're away from their family. And so we know that they do a lot with freshman orientation. So how can you embed this in your freshman orientation? How can you really make this something that is the norm? Can you post in common spaces around mindful practices? Could you have yoga classes, Could you even have courses? We've created a Science of Happiness it's really for secondary students, 6th through 12th grade, but you could pull that into some of your higher ed students, which is just some Google courses, very similar to the adult one that Brandy created, but made for students. And so that could be something you assign them. That could be something that they go through and process and really keep a sleep journal, keep a diet journal, be aware of those things that maybe they weren't previously. And then I think for high school, I think we see a lot of focus on college, right? But we know that our students who are leaving for the military or they're leaving for a career right away, they have to have, as Brady shared in that slide, those skills that employers are working for. And so tying it back to when you leave high school, what are things you can do? Again, as Brandy shared earlier, I've seen a couple of things at the high school level. One was that mindfulness practices where the school-wide did it in the morning, after the lunch, and before they went home, because we know going home can be a trigger for students. And so if there is an expectation in your building that we're all practicing that at the same time, that helps to build those skills. And some peer mentoring from teachers to students who maybe been identified, that really helps to build that connection piece.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I would say gratitude, right? Weaving in gratitude, opportunities for gratitude, critical perspective. So debates seem to be common in the upper grade levels. How do you help teach them? Again, that's perspective taking, empathy, communication skills. It's a lot of those SEL skills. And then I like how Christy added kind of service learning. Mm-hmm. And so I would say both in higher ed and in all levels, but definitely secondary, it can be much more targeted. And think your academic content areas. So my daughter just finished a science course at Butler, and they talked about food deserts. And so that's an entryway into some of these really necessary conversations, but does the educator take the opportunity to do that, right? So that goes back to that educator SEL. And so I think that's where I say you got to start with adults to be able to recognize that this is a great opportunity that we're talking about in our science course, and food and access. So
great. So we have 5 minutes left, so I'm going to try and combo two together to kind of move through quickly. But what do you recommend for educators or maybe counselors and coaches who are wanting to create more buy-in for school-wide implementation of SEL practices? And where can they find maybe data or more information on the effects of the usefulness of implementing these strategies, especially as it pertains to students of color, students from low-income backgrounds, et cetera?
Mm-hmm. The first thing that I would point you to is on our DOE website under the Social-Emotional Learning Competencies. There's something that Brandy created called the Why infographic. And what it will do is explain those benefits that we shared. It'll link you to those resources of where they were found. A lot of the research CASEL has done over the years. But then on the back of that is all 7 of the social-emotional learning skills, but the small, quick definition with 3 strategies. So if I was in the field as a school counselor, social worker again, what I would do is take my staff, bring them together. I would pull up this Why infographic and I would say, take a Post-it, put next to the top 2 skills that you think our students need the most support in right now. And that's where I would start. If you're gonna go into this saying, we're gonna do all 7 of these, you're just not gonna be successful. It's gonna feel overwhelming. Pick a competency or 2, or like we've said many times, take the time to really get the adult SEL, do a book study, view Paper Tigers, view any of those documentaries that really show the why behind this. And also if you're local to Indiana, the Department of Ed, our team provides free professional development. We'll come on site once we're able to, virtually right now, but we'll provide SEL 101 and all of those types of presentations to kind of help build that culture and climate that's primed and ready for that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And a quick follow-up to that. Can folks who aren't school-based reach out about that? So youth serving programs, local.
Yeah, we've actually done the Art Museum. We've done some after-school programming. We work closely with after-school programming as we know they're so important in the work with our families and our students. So yes, we will do that wherever. Again, if you go to our website, there's a tab that says professional development. You list a jot form and then we'll respond to you. Were you going to say anything else?
Yeah, well, I know we're short on time, so no.
Okay.
Anything else?
Yeah.
This will be another quick one. Someone asked, where could they find the TED Talk that you referenced earlier? By Dina, I believe, was the name.
Oh, yeah. I'm happy. I can send that to you if you want me to. I don't have it's not embedded in the presentation, but
Okay.
Can I add it to the chat later, or how does
Yeah,
that? Okay.
if you want to hop in here now, or we can follow up and send it out to folks.
When I end, I'll put it in the chat.
Okay. Right. That covers a good bulk of our questions to go through. There was also questions about the book list that you mentioned, as well as the poster that you highlighted. Are those also found on the IDOE page?
So the growth mindset poster, there was a link on that slide. I think it's page 61, but I could be wrong.
Wow.
And then the book list. So if you pull up the Social Emotional Learning Toolkit and you hit Control Find, you can type in book list. The department, though, we will be hopefully next week putting out a bibliotherapy that will have tabs for each competency. It'll have books, the Lexile level, the grade that it's appropriate for, and then we've added a book list for how to talk about race in your classroom, and then some professional development for yourself around race. So that will be coming out in the next week or so. So if you've not subscribed to Dr. McCormick's weekly email or to our team's newsletter, you can do all of that on our website.
Perfect. Well, thanks everyone for joining. Again, please make sure that you have filled out the survey that's been linked in the chat if you need professional growth points or continuing education units. And please stick around. We have great content the rest of this morning, and we also end the day with Professor Kendi.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much. No, I didn't see the